good to see everyone out today. We will continue our series of sermons through the book of Genesis called Beginnings, and we're looking at different stories and characters in the book. Last week we talked about Abraham and Sarah, and this week we're going to be talking about, there's a little story tucked in the account of Abraham in Genesis 16 about Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar is the mother of Ishmael. And this story is a kind of a unique story. Last week we talked about God coming to Abram and telling him and Sarah were going to have a baby. And Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was 90. But about 4 years before that is where this story takes place. And Sarai at the time was unable to have children, and she obviously was getting up in age and was barren and couldn't have children, and it was really frustrating for her because having children back in those days, especially having sons, was very important to the family and the family name and the family line and all the things that go along with that. And so Sarah decides to take matters into her own hands, if you will, and this is where Hagar and Ishmael come into the story. Hagar was Sarai's maidservant from Egypt, and we see in this account in Genesis 16 that Sarah was unable to have children, and she became so frustrated with waiting on God's promise to provide a child that she decides to take matters into her own hands. And so she goes to her husband Abram and says, "Here's my maidservant Hagar, please sleep with her and take her as your wife and have a child." So that's what Abram did. Now there's nothing in their account, but I don't know, I know it's hard sometimes to put biblical stories in the Old Testament in today's words, but let me assure you, gentlemen, if your wife comes to you and tells you to sleep with another woman, do not do it. That's a bad idea. And even in this time and age, I mean, I know it was common in Old Testament days for sometimes for men to have multiple wives or things like that. But in this account, Sarah tries to take matters in her own hand and make things happen. You see that a lot if you read the entire account of Abraham and Sarah, you see that a lot with them. They try to do things in their own way a lot of times, and it doesn't end well. And so, but she gave her maidservant Hagar to Abram, and he married her and slept with her, and she did become pregnant. Now, the interesting thing about that story is Hagar began to resent her boss or her owner. She began to have ill feelings towards Sarah, and Sarah became jealous of Hagar and regretted the idea of giving Hagar to her husband, and then she blamed Abram for it. You know, come on. It was her idea, now it's his fault. Guys, we know what we're talking about here. But anyway, again, I tell you, if your wife ever comes to you, this is not a good idea. But anyway, so they created this problem. And not only is Sarah aggravated because Hagar is resenting her and not treating her well, but Sarah becomes so jealous that she starts mistreating Hagar, her maidservant. And so Hagar gets tired of being mistreated, so she gets the heck out of Dodge. She just takes off and runs away because she didn't like how she was being treated by her master. And after she left and was away somewhere in the desert, an angel of the Lord came to Hagar and tells her she needs to return back to Sarah and submit to her. And the angel also tells her that he will increase her descendants and she will have a child that she is to name Ishmael. And Ishmael means God hears, or God who hears. And so Hagar, after seeing this angel and hearing this angel tell her the things that God wants her to do, she calls that place where she's at the God who sees me, and she goes on back to Sarai to be a faithful maidservant, and during that time she has this son Ishmael, who is a son of Abram. And again, like I said, Ishmael goes on to be the father of the Arab people. He later on has Isaac, and I actually made a mistake last week. I don't know if anybody caught it. But I said last week that Isaac was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and he was actually the grandfather. He had Jacob and Esau, and Jacob was the father, and I didn't inadvertently said that. And I didn't even realize it until I was downloading the sermon and I heard part of it. I'm like, oh, I said something wrong. I didn't realize it. But anyway, God promises Hagar that her son will also have many descendants, which are the Arab people, and then later on Isaac goes on to have Jacob and has the descendants of God. But what can we learn about this little story tucked into Genesis chapter 16 this morning? And I've got 4 things that I think we can learn from Hagar and Ishmael. The first thing is, don't get ahead of God. This really deals more with Sarah than it does Hagar, but Hagar was really an innocent party. She didn't come and volunteer to her master and say, hey, I'll sleep with your husband and have a kid. No, it was Sarai's idea, and it was because she got tired of waiting to have it. She was frustrated at herself, which happens a lot of times, don't we get mad at ourselves, and then we try to take matters in our own hands, or we get God's taking too long. God's not wanting to do things in our time and our way, so we try to get ahead of God and do things our own way. We think God's going to bless that, but that's not reality. That's not true. God did not bless her idea, and it just caused trouble for Sarah. It blew up in her face, is the easiest way to say that. But let's look at the first 4 verses of Genesis 16. Verses 1 through 4, just the beginning of verse 4, it says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. She said to Abraham, The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave, perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. Bad move, Abram. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. And so we see in this story that Sarah got tired and impatient, waiting on God to give her a child. So she comes up with this idea that, hey, maybe he can get one of my maidservants pregnant, she can have a kid, and I can have a family line through her. Abraham didn't object to this problem. This is, it's the same. You see this, Adam in the garden didn't object to what Eve had asked. He did it. And here again, Abraham agreed to what Sarah wanted to do. Happy wife, happy life, right, guys? Not always. Too many times we try to take matters into our own hands. And we've all been there. I've been there. We get frustrated and tired of waiting on God, so we try to do this on ourselves. But the truth of the matter is, part of growing and maturing as a Christian is learning to be patient and trust God and His timing and His will. And I love this quote by Rick Warren. It says, God is never in a hurry, but He's always on time. I believe there's even a gospel song out similar to that. And it's true. God's timing is not our timing. God's ways are not our ways. We learned that last week. His ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. So God's timing is perfect. God's will is perfect. And it doesn't always fit in our timeline. And again, I blame some of this on the American culture because we are people who are always in a hurry. We're always driving fast. We're always in a hurry to get our food and get things done. We don't want to wait on things. That's why credit card debt and all those things have become so prevalent in modern ages, because people, my grandparents' generation, they paid for things. They paid cash for things, or they saved up money and bought things. My generation charged everything. And that still goes on today. We want things now. We don't want to wait on them. And so we can end up in a lot of debt and a lot of things. But we also can apply that to our spiritual lives, our personal lives. A lot of people marry the wrong person because they don't wait on God or don't include God in that process. Because they want to hurry up and get married and have a family and have children and all that. They don't see the consequences of having children in a marriage that doesn't work, and then end up growing up in a home where your children have to grow up in maybe a divorced home, or parents fighting all the time, or something like that. We do that in our careers. We choose careers. We choose money and maybe ego over being in the place God wants us to work or wants us to serve. There's just lots of scenarios where we try to get ahead of God because we don't want to wait on God. And I want to encourage you this morning, do not be like Sarai, but wait on God. Because we knew God was going to provide this baby for her, that Abram and her were going to have a baby even in their old age, because God can make things happen. I like what was written in Psalms 27, verse 14. wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. And that's simply what we have to do. We have to not get ahead of God and wait on the Lord, however long that wait is. And you don't know how long that wait will be. If you think about this, maybe you've prayed for years for your husband to be saved, or your wife to be saved, or your children, your adult children to be saved, or whatever. Don't stop praying for those things. Maybe you've thought about, you have a relationship in your life that you don't get along, or you're separated, or whatever. Don't stop praying for that person. There's lots of things in our life that we get tired of waiting on, and we give up on, or we throw in the towel, or we try to do things on our own. I simply want to tell you, keep trusting God and keep praying. The way our faithful prayers are not being ignored. We might think it is because of the time that God hears our prayers. We need to trust that He will answer them in His way, and His will, and His timing. And God's timing is everything. And if you don't wait on the Lord's timing, you're going to be out of His will. But more importantly, you're going to be like Sarah and have to live with unpleasant consequences. And so we need to think about that. Which brings me to my next point is, and it's kind of a long-worded point. I tried to shorten it, but I couldn't find the right way. But there's always regret and trouble when you don't follow God's plans. So many times the regrets in our life and the trouble we get into is simply because we try to do things with our own strength, our own power, our own wisdom, our own control. We try to control things in our life. We don't fully surrender ourselves to God. And there's always regret and trouble when we do that. We may not see it right now in the moment when the emotions are high. We've got these strong feelings, but I'm going to tell you, we have the luxury of seeing Sarah and Hagar's story afterwards and looking at the big picture. They didn't have that at the time, but Sarah was setting herself up for some heartache and frustration. Look at the next part of the verse, beginning with the last part of verse 4 in chapter 16. It says, and this is talking about Hagar. It says, Hagar, when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abraham, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. And I don't know exactly what that means. Maybe after Hagar became a wife of Abram, she thought, hey, why am I this woman's servant? I'm equal. I'm a wife just like she is. Or maybe she was arrogant because she had a baby and Sarah couldn't have one. So maybe she threw in her face. I don't know exactly what despisable means. But we know that when you despise someone, you have ill will towards them or think poorly of them or something like that. And so that's exactly what's going on in the story. And Sarah goes on to say, may the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. So Abraham puts it back on Sarai. Sarai comes to Abram and says, hey, look what you've done. Now it's his fault. See, I told you, don't do it. And Abram says, hey, you do with her whatever you want. Do what you think is best. And then Sarai, what did she do? She mistreated Hagar. So Hagar fled from her. So Sarai took out her frustrations and anger on Hagar. Not only that she couldn't have a child, but that her maidservant was pregnant with a child, and all that dynamics of that relationship. And so she treated her so horribly that Hagar was like, heck with this, I'm leaving. And so she fled. But all of this makes me think, that Sarai wasn't thinking ahead. She wasn't thinking about the consequences. And not only that, let's be real honest and clear. She disobeyed God by not waiting on God and taking matters in her own hand. God promised they would have a child. He didn't say it would be now, next week. He just said you're going to have a child. Just like He promised Abram the day that He asked him to leave. I'm going to take you to a land and you're going to have children. Your descendants are going to be numerous as the stars in the sky. He didn't tell him where he was going. He didn't tell him how long that would take, but He just simply wanted them to trust. And that's what Sarah should have did. And so her life was filled with regret and trouble and drama because she tried to do things on her own. And I think all of us have faced regret by not obeying God and waiting on His timing. We talked about this in Sunday school a little bit this morning. Because I said, a lot of people said live your life with no regrets. But that's garbage. We all, I think, have regrets. I would love to live my life without regrets, but the reality is I have regrets. There's things I've said and done that I shouldn't have done and said. There's a lot of things that happen that I wish I could do over or change. And that's not, the reality is you can't. Once you've said something, did something, whatever, it's done. And we can have regrets about that. Now, again, regret is just like conviction. It can be a good thing. Regret can motivate us to not make the same mistakes. I don't think regret is always a bad thing, but if you dwell on those regrets, you can really spiral down into hate, resentment, and a lot of different things if you don't deal with regret. But I like this quote that I don't know, I came across it, and it doesn't have who the author of it is. It's ironic that it kind of fits with our story here. It says, it's better to sleep on what you plan to do than to be kept awake by what you've done. And, you know, a lot of times we have to, you know, be kept awake by the poor choices and decisions we've made. And I would much better sleep on what you plan and not actually follow through with it. I get it. I mean, we've all thinking, you know, why is God taking so long? Or why doesn't he answer my prayer? It's one thing to think it. It's another thing to dwell on it so much that we actually act on it. And then we begin to make poor choices and decisions, and we're kept awake by the mistakes and poor choices we've done because we have regret or turmoil or trouble in our lives. And so we need to be careful that we don't live a life like that, but we try to be obedient and faithful to God. Proverbs 19:21, Solomon said, many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. So we need to think about that in our day-to-day lives. You know, are my plans my plans? Am I making my own plans, or is the Lord's will prevailing in my life? And we want his plan to prevail in our life. Or we're going to be left like Sarai here, living a life with regret and trouble in her life and in her marriage. And certainly this didn't just affect Sarai, it affected her relationship with Abram, it affected her relationship with her maidservant. A lot of things happened. The next thing I think we can learn from this story of Hagar and Ishmael is we need to listen to the Lord. We need to listen to the Lord. Hagar obviously got upset with the way she was being treated by Sarai, so she decides to run away and flee. You know, it's better to go out in the desert and be on my own and try to make it and live under this roof in this situation. So she flees. But along the way, God comes to her. And let's look at that story, pick up out on verse 7. It says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, or slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Now, I know we're not in Hagar's situation, but we've all been in situations where we've tried to run away from it or flee it. Maybe not physically, in a sense, but maybe so. But there's things we avoid or things we don't want to do, things we try to sweep under the rug or put away. But God sends an angel to Hagar and says, hey, you need to go back to your mistress and submit to her. Well, obviously, that's probably not what she wanted to hear. Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear, oh, you got to go back and follow the rules. You know, it's not, God will sometimes tell us to do things we don't want to do. But that's where spiritual maturity and faithfulness to God comes in. That said, even though I don't want to do this, even though I don't like how this makes me feel, even though I don't really want to be a part of this, I believe God has convicted me to stay where I am or to do what he tells me and be submissive. One of the hardest things to do in our relationship with God is to be submissive and submit to him, to surrender to him. I said this recently in a sermon, I think it was last week or the week before last. A lot of people want Jesus to be their Savior, but they don't want him to be Lord. In other words, they want to be saved, they don't want to go to hell, but at the same time they don't want God in their day-to-day lives controlling what they do. We still want to be in control and in charge. But one of the things we have to learn, if we're going to grow and mature in our faith and have a real relationship with God, is we have to submit to his authority. We have to submit to his will. We have to surrender our will to his. Not my will, Father, but yours. And we have to surrender to him and go where he tells us to go and do what he tells us to do. But the angel tells her, I want you to go back to Sarai, your mistress, to submit to her, but I also want you to know that I will increase your descendants so much that they'll be too numerous to count. So not only does he tell her something she doesn't necessarily want to hear, but he also gives her a promise that in the bigger picture, in the end of it, there's going to be goodness to come. And so she obviously is faithful and responsive to that. It says, the angel of the Lord said to her, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. Now, I don't know if that's a compliment or not, but somebody called me a donkey. I'm not sure about that. And a wild donkey at that. We have another word for that. But anyway, he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all of his brothers. It's really, I would be like, hey, you're really not cheering me up here. First of all, you're telling me to go back to a situation I don't want to go in. Now you're telling me this kid I'm going to have is going to be a donkey and nobody's going to like him. You know, you ain't going to get along with anybody. But anyway, this is all part of God's plan and all part of this story. And the angel promises her that her descendants will be there will be a lot of them, and she tells him what to name her son. God is hearing you. And I promise you, when God speaks, we need to listen to him. And we need to understand God hears us even when we don't think he does. Now, I believe God is more receptive and more attentive to the prayers and needs of faithful Christians than are people who are rebellious and disobedient. You know, we go to God like a get-out-of-jail-free card, or we go to God like, you know, I want you to get me out of this ticket or get me out of this situation. You know, we don't want to face the consequences of our poor decisions, and we don't go to God to bail us out. That's not how God works, but I do believe God hears the prayers of his faithful saints and those who trust in him. And so God sends this angel to speak to Hagar, and she does listen to him, and she does obey. And we don't want to be like that. If you think about it, throughout the history of the Old Testament, the Israelites were always disobedient to God. They always ignored his instructions, and even God came to them and gave them a chance to repent before he punished them, and they didn't do that. I like what he says in Isaiah 39, talking about this one. These are rebellious people, deceitful children unwilling to listen to the Lord's instruction. That's not a compliment. He's saying this about these people. They're rebellious, deceitful, unwilling to listen. And we don't want to be like that when it comes to God. When God is giving us instructions, when he's giving us warnings, when he's giving us guidance, or trying to provide help for us, we need to listen and we need to be obedient and we need to follow. We need to always listen to God's voice. If we listen and follow God's word and his Holy Spirit working in our lives are going to be blessed. We're going to have less regret, less trouble when we are obedient to God. I heard a preacher say a long time ago, and this always stuck with me. He said, you know, a lot of times people ask, what's God's voice sound like? And he said, every time I hear a voice in my head and it sounds like my voice, I know it's not God. It's me. You know, it makes sense, though, because you might talk to yourself a lot or hear your voice inside your mind a lot. And those times it doesn't sound like you, it's usually God. But the times that it sounds like our own voice, it's either us or us allowing Satan to talk us into things. So you might want to keep that in mind. But we need to follow God and trust in him and listen to him. Some of you might remember in the New Testament the story of the Transfiguration, where Jesus went up on the mountain and he invited Peter, James, and John up with him. And while he was up there, he transfigured before their eyes, and they saw Moses and Elijah. But you remember God spoke to them and told them something? You remember what God told Peter and James and John? It says, then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, this is my son whom I love. Listen to him. That's still true today. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. We need to listen to him. My final thought this morning out of Hagar and Ishmael is God hears and sees us. God hears and sees us. God, even though Hagar felt like she was suffering and being mistreated and she ran away, God reminded her that, hey, I hear you. Obviously, he told her to name the baby Ishmael, which means God hears. So not only that, he hears us, he sees us, he is God, he knows what's going on. Look at the last part of this text today in verse 13, beginning of verse 13. Talking about Hagar, it says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the place is called Bir Lahai Roi, is still there between Kadesh and Bered. Now, in this story, not only does God tell Hagar, hey, you're going to have this son, I want you to name him Ishmael, the God who sees, the God who hears me. But then Hagar returns the favor. The place where she's at when God speaks to her, she names this Bir Lahai Roi, or the well of the living one. This is the God who sees me. So not only does God hear her, but God sees her. And the thing about this story is this isn't a different God The God who is speaking to Hagar and who she's interacting with is the same God that we serve today, the same God that we have in our lives. Hagar was being persecuted by Sarai, and God recognized that. Sometimes we think God ignores our pain, and we think God doesn't see us, He doesn't hear us, He's letting people get by with stuff. But never be confused or fooled by Satan. God always knows what's going on. God is not hiding. God is not ignoring us when we suffer and when we hurt. He sees it and hears us. Now, I don't always know why He allows it to happen. I don't always know why, a certain amount of time. But one thing I've learned to do is trust in God's timing and trust in His will and understand He's not ignoring me. He's not blind to my problems. He's not hiding from me. He knows exactly what's going on, and in His timing, in His way, He will take care of the situation according to His will. I like this text, this next text in verse 15 says, So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son he had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar was born him and Ishmael. So we see that Ishmael came along at 86, 4 years before that actual promise happened. So it was another 4 years before Sarah and Abram had a kid. So they had to wait 4 more years, and the only problem was Hagar now had an awkward situation with her master, and now Abram had another son ahead of God's plan. Now God, interestingly, still used Ishmael and still used Hagar, even though it was out of His will. He didn't forget them. And so we need to understand from this story that God heard Hagar and had her go back, but He had plans for her. He had plans for Ishmael. And God always hears and sees us. He hears and sees us when we're suffering, when we're hurting, when we're in pain, when things don't go our way, when we're mistreated. A lot of times we see things on TV and bad things happen. We think, how does God allow that to happen? Why would a loving God do that? But we need to understand that God is God and we are not. And His ways are not earthly ways. They're not human ways. And we can't even begin to wrap our human minds around God's will and God's wisdom. But I do believe we can look at Scripture. Like this one in Psalms 34, verse 17, it says, The righteous cry out and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from all their troubles. Well, if that's in Scripture, then I should believe that that's one of God's promises. If the righteous cry out, the Lord hears them and He delivers them from all their troubles. Now, the key word in there is the righteous cry out. In order, I believe, for God to hear us, we need to be righteous. We can't be disobedient and selfish and self-centered and egotistical and prideful and think God's just going to give us all of our wishes and wants. That's not how it works. But if I'm faithful to God, if I'm living in right relationship with Him, when I'm in distress, I can cry out to the Lord and He will hear me and He will deliver me. Now again, His delivery and help will be in His time and will. It might not be right that moment. It might not be instant gratification. It might be tomorrow. It might be next week. It might be next year. It might be 5 years from now. I don't know. But one of the things we have to learn to do is trust and wait in His timing. I want to close this morning with a story that I came across, and I think it kind of ties all of this in together this morning. I came across this illustration of this little boy who was looking forward to going to a birthday party. And this little boy wanted to go to his friend, and their friend only lived a few blocks away, and he wanted to walk to that party. Well, the day finally arrived for the birthday party, but unfortunately the weather did not cooperate. A blizzard came in and was snowing heavily, and it made the sidewalks and the roads nearly impassable. People weren't getting out, and the boy's father hesitated to let his son go. Now, shouldn't the other parents just cancel the party and move it? They didn't. The youngster reacted tearfully, but Dad, he pleaded, all the other kids are going to be there. The other parents are still letting their kids go. And so the father thought for a moment, and then he replied, all right, son, you can go. And so the surprised boy was excited and overjoyed, and he got all bundled up and put on all his winter clothes, his boots and his hat and his gloves and all that stuff, and he headed out into the raging storm. And keep in mind, he's only going a few blocks away. The driving snow made it visibly almost impossible, and it took him more than a half hour to just go the few blocks that he was going, just a short distance away. But he finally made it there after a 30-minute walk, which should have took 5 or 10 minutes. As he rang the doorbell, he turned around briefly to look behind himself at the storm, and he caught the eye of a shadowy figure retreating down the street. That shadowy figure was his father. The father had followed his son's every step to make sure that he arrived safely at a distance. The reason why I share that story with you this morning is because God is that way. God is close by. He's never far away. And He's always making sure that we get and have whatever we need to keep us safe. We need to listen to Him. We may not always feel Him. We may not always see Him. We may not always know the outcome of what's going on, but we can trust that God is always there. God heard Hagar. God protected Ishmael. And God worked in her life, and He can do the same thing in our life this morning. We're going to offer our invitation at this time. I'm going to have the praise team come forward, and we're going to sing a song of decision. And if anybody needs to respond to that song, you can meet me down front as we stand and sing.